Hey students, this is Mr. Moore. I'm here with our AP European History class, week 15 notes. Last week we were talking about the French Revolution, the bloody and dangerous mess that it was, and its ideals are going to be spread throughout the entire continent of Europe. During the French Revolution, there was a young general who started out in the military ranks as an artillery officer. And during the French Revolution, he gained popularity and he gained experience as a military leader defending the borders of France. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He's probably one of the most famous figures in history, and we're going to talk about his successes and failures and talk about this era of the Napoleonic Wars. And we're really going to focus from 1800 up to 1815. That's when Napoleon was running France. It's important to remember that the decade before this, from 1789 until 1799, is really what we consider the French Revolution. So this is exactly the next 15 years after the French Revolution. Napoleon was involved in the French Revolution during when people's heads were being chopped off, back in Paris and other parts of France. Napoleon was serving in the military, protecting its borders and fighting a military campaign in Italy. He was also fighting a military campaign down in Egypt, and even ended up in the Middle East, places like Syria and things. He was all over Europe trying to defend France during the Revolution and protect France from her enemies. And near the end of the French Revolution, Napoleon did participate in a military overthrow of the French government, what we like to call a coup, or more properly, a coup d'etat. And last week we kind of discussed that. Then Napoleon is going to become the leader of France, and he's going to go on a huge military spree across the entire continent, kicking butt wherever he went. And so we're going to dive into this, and we're going to see what are the effects of the Napoleonic Wars on Europe in the early 19th century. Okay, so let's dive into just a quick recap of the primary fundamental pieces of the French Revolution, because what Napoleon does is he tries to preserve the best parts of the French Revolution. It's easy for a lot of us to look at the French Revolution and see the blood and the heads that were chopped off during the Reign of Terror. But there was some good ideas that came out of the French Revolution, trying to undo the ancien regime, or the old regime. The battle cry of the French Revolution is still the mantra of, or motto of, the French today: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so those are the things that Napoleon tried to preserve. And as he went on this military spree across Europe, his troops, wherever he would go and conquer, his troops would bring the ideas of the French Revolution to the places that they conquered. And so, in a short sentence, the Napoleonic Wars are going to spread the ideas of the French Revolution across the continent of Europe. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, when I talk about Napoleon, I'm talking about a military genius, okay, who was born in the 1700s and dies in the 1800s, okay? I'm not talking about this Napoleon, right? Just to be clear. All right, let's look at how much conquering Napoleon did while he was on his military campaigns. You can see that the map of Europe back in the early 1800s is not the same as it looks today, at least politically. You can see this red outline is outlining all of the places that France was in control of by the time that Napoleon was done with his conquests. Okay, so you can see he really did a spectacular job. A couple of things that I find really interesting Lots of times we look at Napoleon and we think of him in a sort of a hero sort of a mentality, right? Napoleon was the hero of France. Basically, what he did is go on a rampage and take over the continent of Europe. Now you fast forward 100 years into the 1900s, and you get somebody like Hitler who tries to do the exact same thing, and he's one of the biggest villains in all of history. So, what makes the difference between Napoleon, who's generally considered a good guy per se, and Hitler? Why? What makes him such a bad guy? And you might say, well, duh, Mr. Moore, it's because he killed all the Jewish people. So, because he was racist? That's what made it different because both of these guys did a heck of a lot of killing. Okay, so it's really interesting. What makes a person a good guy or bad guy is not necessarily the number of people that it's killed, but maybe the reason why they were killed. I don't know. It's just fascinating, interesting questions that don't always have a right or wrong answer, but are fascinating to think about and talk about. And I'm going to make a couple of Napoleon Hitler analogies today because honestly, there's several things that are similar between the two conquerors. And when I say similar, I mean places where they failed to finish the job and to completely be masters of Europe. Here's an interesting piece of U.S. history that I suspect you know because the last class you took was a U.S. history class. Napoleon sold a giant chunk of North America to the United States in the early 1800s. Thomas Jefferson is the third president of the United States. So it goes George Washington, then John Adams, then Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson happened to be the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence back in 1776. And Thomas Jefferson was on a diplomatic mission over to France trying to secure French aid during the American Revolution and succeeded. There was others who went with him, like John Adams goes over, Benjamin Franklin, but Thomas Jefferson secures French aid during the American Revolution. And Thomas Jefferson was living in France when the United States was, declaring its independence. And when the United States was signing an agreement in Paris, Thomas Jefferson is there when we're ending the American Revolution. And so Thomas Jefferson is in France when the French Revolution breaks out and even helped Lafayette write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And so, of course, when George Washington becomes our first president a few years after the American Revolution, he asks Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. And so Jefferson comes back to the United States and serves in the first cabinet under George Washington. And then, of course, he runs for president and becomes president, the third president. Thomas Jefferson is looking to expand west, and Napoleon is looking to make money to fund his military campaigns over in Europe. And Napoleon had secured this territory that we call Louisiana. Now, today, of course, there's a state called Louisiana down here, named after Louis XIV, but the entire watershed, in other words, all of the water that ends up dumping into the Missouri River and then dumping into the Mississippi River, the United States bought the water rights. That's really what the Louisiana Purchase was. And so Napoleon sold a huge chunk of North America. The French controlled this at the time. They actually got it from the Spanish as a part of Napoleon's kicking butt over in Europe. And so our third president in 1803 bought this giant chunk of land. Okay, so I think that's really interesting. After Thomas Jefferson had bought the Louisiana Purchase or territory, he had to go send surveyors out to see what he had actually bought. And that's, of course, why he hires the Lewis and Clark, program to go out and explore, map, and dialogue, keep good records, scientific studies of what's going on out in the middle of the continent. Okay, little piece of U.S. history that ties in directly to what we're talking about in European history. Napoleon was looking for money. So Let's remember what part Napoleon plays in the French Revolution. We must remember that things got really bad in France during the Revolution. That's an understatement, right? Remember the Reign of Terror and the number of heads that were chopped off? And at the same time as France was going through its own turmoil internally, the enemies of France, the countries around France, were taking a crack at France, literally sending troops to try to stop the revolution from happening. And you might say, why were they trying to stop the revolution from happening? Remember that kings and emperors controlled all of the countries in Europe. So they don't want a king, even though they don't like the French. They don't want the same thing to happen in their own country that's happening in France, and so they wanted to stop the revolution. It's not too hard to think about this, but if there's an emperor of Austria or a king of Spain or a king of Prussia, they want to help protect the idea of monarchy in France. They don't want the peasants to rise up and overthrow the king because they don't want that same thing to happen in their country. And so that's why they were attacking France, and also to take advantage of France and its weakness. Okay? Napoleon gains his reputation defending France and fighting wars during the French Revolution. So he gains his popularity fighting for the French army during the Revolution. At the end of the Revolution, remember in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte ends the revolution in a coup, and he restores order to France. And that's one of the key things. He calls himself the consul or the consulate because that's an old Roman word for a military leader who would come in and restore order to a republic. And it's kind of like, what somebody like Julius Caesar was kind of claiming to do, or there's a lot of others that came before him, Gaius and some others. If you get into Roman history, you can see these guys who would act as the consul. And the idea was that they would seize military or they would seize temporary power to fix the problems in the country, promising, of course, to return said power to the citizens. And Napoleon acts as consul, and then he kind of transitioned it to consul for life, and then he ends up crowning himself emperor in 1804. Okay, and he implements a set of laws called the Napoleonic Code. These are laws that are going to become universal, really, throughout Europe. And they're going to be the basis for the modern law systems in so many countries across the continent of Europe. And remember, because Europe is in the process of taking over the world, these are really going to be the groundwork for laws around the world. Okay, and he's, of course, trying to preserve the best parts of the French Revolution. I'll give you some specifics in just a minute. So, in the long run, as a reminder, the people of France were angry and frustrated about taxes and about inequality and the fact that they had no say in the estates general, that the first estate, the church, and the second estate, the nobility, made out only 3% of the population, had all of the power and money, and the 97% of regular people had very little power. And the revolution is to overthrow that system, the old system, the ancien regime. And so the people of France replace Louis XVI. The problem is the guy who replaces Louis XVI is a dictator who acts like a king, or maybe even worse than the king. Robespierre is the guy who really runs the Reign of Terror. He's a part of what they called, and here's my air quotes again, the Committee of Public Safety. But it doesn't make France safe at all. But they attack anyone who they feel like is going against the revolution, and anybody who had money back in the old regime is getting their heads chopped off. And because of all the chaos and disorder and the fact that France was falling apart, the people really supported Napoleon, who comes in to replace Robespierre. This is a process. It's not like overnight. But in the end, we end up with Napoleon, who crowns himself emperor. And that is an ironic contradiction, right? In some ways, people say that the French Revolution failed because we went from a king to a guy who acted like a king to an emperor. But some people say the French Revolution was incredibly successful because the ideas of the French Revolution spread: liberty, equality, fraternity. And those ideas spread. The idea that you shouldn't be able to be born into privilege, but you need to work for privilege, right? So some people say that the revolution was successful because of Napoleon, because he's going to spread those ideas across the continent. One of the first things that Napoleon does as he becomes consul, he enacts the Concordat of 1801. And what this is Napoleon signs an agreement with the Pope to heal the rift caused by the French Revolution. Remember that one piece of the French Revolution was trying to de-Christianize France. And of all the things that was really radical, that was probably the most. A lot of people are like, yeah, the king's corrupt and nobody likes the king unless you're a monarchist, because if you get to benefit from the king, like if your family is nobility, then of course you like there being a king, because if your family's in close with the king, or maybe one of your daughters could marry the next king, then it kind of gives you that power. So there were some people who supported monarchies and monarchism, but we've got to remember that almost every country in Europe is a Christian country. And so when France de-Christianized, it really sent shockwaves, and a lot of that angered a lot of people. And so Napoleon, one of the things he wanted to do was fix that rift. And so he meets with the Pope, and they sign agreements to restore Christianity into France. And they go back to the Christian calendar. So they stop using the 10-day-a-week calendar, and they kind of undo the renaming of the calendar, and they go back to the original dates that we still use today. So this is his chance to kind of rectify the French Revolution with Christians around Europe. Very important step. This is that painting of Napoleon crowning himself emperor. And he also was married. We'll talk about her in just a little bit. But there's some famous paintings of him taking the crown for himself, and here acknowledging who's going to be his wife. And his wife was Josephine. And Napoleon fell madly in love with Josephine. She had been married before, but her husband died by guillotine during the French Revolution. So Josephine already had a couple of kids by the time she met Napoleon. She was a pretty well-known woman in Paris, and had lots of lovers, and was very influential. And when she met Napoleon, he fell madly in love with her, and she saw his potential. And so they hooked up and got married. However, because she was a little bit older than him, and by the time they actually got married, it kind of seems pretty evident that she was past her childbearing years. Maybe she lied about her age or what when she met Napoleon, because her kids were older. They weren't like little kids by the time Napoleon and her hook up. So the point is that Napoleon and Josephine didn't have any children. And Napoleon is kind of a self-made king, if you will. He calls himself the Emperor of France, but he's kind of like establishing his own monarchy, his own dynasty, which is ironic, right? Because he's supposed to be the hero of the French Revolution. That's ironic and contradictory, as I just stated. So at some point, whether he was in love with Josephine or not, he does divorce her, and he finds himself an Austrian princess to which he can have children with. So hopefully he can pass on his powers of emperor, right, and start a new dynasty in France and kind of across Europe. Napoleon also is famous for putting family members on thrones of countries that he conquered. Like he put his brother on the Spanish throne when he conquers there. So if you were a family member of Napoleon, in some ways this is an ironic contradiction, but he kind of becomes the new monarch. Okay? So that's Napoleon and Josephine. Um, let's dive into the Napoleonic Code for a little bit, and I don't want to get it too complicated, but the Napoleonic Code is a set of laws, and it kind of proves Napoleon's, in some ways, his domestic greatness. That is what he did for the French people. A set of laws for France and a set of laws for the citizens of France. He standardized the laws across all of France and later used as the basis for laws in most countries across Europe because Napoleon conquered most of Europe. The code covered civil law, property law, family law, and individual rights. Unfortunately, it left women out of a lot of this, which is frustrating, right? It's a double standard. Men got a lot of freedom, equality, and fraternity, but women didn't. They were kind of second class citizens, if you will. But he did introduce standardization in measurements. If you are familiar with the metric system, now, everybody should be familiar with the metric system. It's the most widely used system in the world. It's pretty much used in every country except the United States. Sometimes Americans get frustrated in a science class when they have to learn the metric system, but everyone else on the planet Earth uses it except for Americans. And Napoleon was one. I mean, the metric system kind of started during the French Revolution to codify and put things into a standard order. But because of the Napoleonic conquest, these ideas spread across the globe. And of course, he improves the economy of France. And he introduces, stable banking and commercial reforms and education reforms, right? And the sciences and art is promoted. These are the underlining ideas of our modern world. There's something called meritocracy. Meritocracy is people getting ahead in life based on their merit rather than who their parents were. For instance, as long as we look back in history, like in medieval Europe and even during the age of absolutism and the Reformation and Renaissance, that like the whole time we've been talking in this class, and even way before, you get to be king because your father was, right? Because you're born into a noble family. You could be a screw up, you could be stupid, and you're still king, not because of your greatness or your own deeds, but because you're born into the right family. And so the French Revolution was trying to undo that and trying to base people's merits on what they achieve. So equality before the law, property rights, religious tolerance, modern secular education, because remember, back in medieval times, the only education people got was from the Bible. Literally, it was the church that ran all of the universities. So people studied theology. But because of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, people started to look at more secular things. Remember that secularism really was born out of the Renaissance, right? So we're kind of trying together the pieces of this class. Sound finances were championed, consolidated and codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon, right? He built roads, he built canals and public schools for the French people. And I don't need to maybe go through all of these so in depth, but you can look at the pros. There's equality in the eyes of the law, and no recognition of privilege based on birth, unless you happen to be related to Napoleon, right? But freedom of religion kind of starts to become a thing, right? Separation of church and state, freedom to work in an occupation of one's own choice, and strengthening the family unit. On the other hand, women didn't have the right to vote, right? Women were basically owned or had to be obedient to their husband, and their husband had total control of property. Unmarried women had few rights. Okay, it was easier for a man to sue for divorce than a woman, right? If a man was cheating on his wife, no big deal. But if a woman was cheating on her husband, boom, right? That's a total double standard. That's a huge problem. So I kind of put this arrow here in the middle, kind of talking about the two of them. It preserved the social aims of the revolution. It protected the interest of the rising middle class, which there really wasn't before, right? And it guaranteed civil liberties. But if you were a woman, you were kind of left out of the picture. Jacques-Louis David is a famous neoclassic artist who did a lot of paintings of Napoleon, like as he's crossing the Alps on his horse, and it's done in a particular style, kind of a new classic style of artwork. And we're going to spend some time later in class, kind of going over the evolution of art from medieval art to the Renaissance to that mannerism and Baroque style into this neoclassicism. And after, kind of during the middle of, and even after the age of Napoleon, we're going to get into Romantic art. So we're going to talk about the evolution of art at a later time. But I'm going to integrate some of that artwork here into my lectures and notes. There's some great literature that comes out of the French Revolution, but also out of the Napoleonic Wars that follow. Probably the most famous novel about the Napoleonic Wars is a novel called War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. It is probably one of the most epic novels ever written, probably one of the most famous novels ever written. To say that a novel is the best is an opinion and not a fact. But if you ever look at like a list of the top best novels ever written, almost always War and Peace ends up on that list, and it takes place really from the Russian point of view during the Napoleonic conquests, and it follows the life of different characters as they struggle during this age of conflict. And usually when we're in class, I'll even show a couple clips from War and Peace from a TV miniseries so that you kind of get the feel for a Napoleonic battle. But you could probably just as easily go and Google it on YouTube or whatever and see some videos of what a Napoleonic battle might have looked like. At the end of my notes, I've got tons of videos kind of covering the Napoleonic Wars. One of the most significant things that Napoleon did while he was conquering in Europe is he dismantles the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, I mean, some historians will trace it back to 800 AD when Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as the new emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day, 800 AD. So the Holy Roman Empire has been around for a long time. But after the 30 Years' War, remember that Peace of Westphalia in 1648? In 1648, after the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Empire was really never the same. And even though it still existed for more than 100 years longer, it was kind of limping along. And two pieces of the Holy Roman Empire were really growing into their own political entities. Those two pieces would be Prussia, as you can see on this map, Prussia, not Russia, that's totally different, and Austria. These are two Germanic states that kind of evolve out of the Holy Roman Empire. And even though they were slowly becoming their own political entities, they still were a part of the Holy Roman Empire until 1806, when Napoleon defeats Prussia and Austria and dismantles kind of dismantles the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so that's a really significant thing that he did. One of Napoleon's most fierce enemies were the British. And the problem with the British is that the British live on islands. And so even though they're a part of Europe, they have a natural protection around their kingdom, around their empire. Their empire spreads around the globe. And by the 1800s, they've got ports and trade all over the globe. But at least their homeland is protected by the oceans. And this is the same thing that helps protect them in the 1900s from Hitler. If you want to attack or invade the United Kingdom, you have to get across the English Channel. And who has the best navy in the world? The British. So Napoleon builds up his navy, and he's going to try to, conquer the British Navy so that he can invade Great Britain, but he's going to fail. just to give you the spoiler right now, he's going to fail. To be truthful, a little over, a little over 100 years later, Hitler's going to try the same thing with airplanes. He's going to try to bomb the heck out of the British Isles so that he can invade, but he's not successful. So the British have this natural boundary around them that's going to protect them both from Napoleonic invasion and from Nazi invasion a little over 100 years later. Okay, so because Napoleon can't quite invade Great Britain, what he tries to do is to economically attack Great Britain. And so what he does is he sets up this continental system. It's basically economic war on Great Britain. So they're going to have trade within all of these countries on the continent that Napoleon is controlling and kind of leave Great Britain out of it, trying to exclude them from trade. However, Russia kind of breaks the deal and does start trading with Great Britain. Russia does. And that's going to force Napoleon to invade Russia, which is going to be maybe one of the pieces of his downfall. There's lots of famous battles that we could talk about. Probably Napoleon's greatest moment is the Battle of Austerlitz, where he is way outnumbered, but by using kick butt strategy and being aggressive on the battlefield, having well-disciplined troops that are highly trained, he wins against the odds. Okay, there are some battles that Napoleon loses. Okay, and there are some battles that are sometimes a draw. Right, the Battle of Borodino is in Russia, and some people say Napoleon won because he kept advancing, but some people say the Russians, they did what they were supposed to do and kind of prevented him. Napoleon, he kind of loses in Russia, not really on the battlefield. See, that's why you're like, Mr. Moore, make up your mind. Just tell us, did he win or lose in Russia? We're going to get to that. He definitely comes out of Russia having lost, but not necessarily on the battlefield. But they slowed him down enough that the Russian winter is going to kill his troops off and prevent him from really becoming master of Russia. So in the end, yeah, the Russians are going to win. But again, not necessarily on the battlefield. So there's always complexity to it. One thing that's great is on the AP test, they're never going to ask you specifically about, battles or military strategy. But as a historian, I kind of like to look at it and help you become familiar with some of those. Probably Napoleon's one of his greatest losses. He wasn't necessarily there at this battle because it's a sea battle, and Napoleon is definitely a guy on land, commanding troops and especially using artillery. Napoleon was famous for his use of artillery with his 12-pounders that could shoot, what I've read, they could shoot about 5 miles. That's a long ways to shoot artillery piece in the early 1800s. But because Napoleon was trying to invade Great Britain, he sends his ships, and Lord Nelson, the commander of the British Navy, stops Napoleon's attempts to invade Great Britain during the War of the Third Coalition. So people like to break up the Napoleonic Wars into segments, from the First Coalition during the French Revolution to the Seventh Coalition, where Napoleon finally capitulates. But the French lost 22-0. In other words, the British sank 22 French ships. The French sunk 0 British ships. Lord Nelson becomes a hero of Great Britain. Okay, Lord Nelson. And Trafalgar becomes one of the most famous battles in British history. If you go to London, there's like this central place in London that they call Trafalgar Square, and they've got statues of Lord Nelson, and it's like it's kind of like Times Square in New York City. Everybody in London knows it. Okay. So the Napoleonic Wars are a series of conflicts as Napoleon goes on a military conquest across Europe, spreading ideas of the French Revolution. Like I told you already, he puts his brother on the Spanish throne when he conquers Spain. Spain, Great Britain, Austria, Prussians, and Russians okay, and really the rest of Europe, joined together to stop the Grand Army. And the Grand Army is Napoleon's army. Um, and he uses recruits from places that he conquers, but it's also his highly specialized French forces. Okay, so if you want me to sum this up, it's really France versus the rest of Europe, and Napoleon and his Grand Army do a spectacular job. The Napoleonic Wars are referred to by the 7 coalitions of European countries that are formed to fight him. A coalition is like an alliance of countries. Okay, so even countries that don't necessarily like each other will work together to try to stop Napoleon. So the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the British and the Spanish when they can, and even Portugal are all going to gang up on France to try to put Napoleon down. Here's something that's also really interesting. If you're a student of American history, you know that the second war in American history is called the War of 1812. The first war is the American Revolution, where we fight the British and gain our independence. But a few years after we gain our independence, the British start a second war. Well, Americans like to say the British started it. They were impressing sailors, and they weren't respecting the treaty. They weren't respecting our sovereignty. And so the United States declares war on Great Britain in 1812. Just to be clear, the British are right in the middle of fighting Napoleon during the War of 1812. So the British already have their hands full fighting Napoleon. And all of their troops are highly trained and have had real battle experience fighting the French soldiers in the battlefields of Europe and the battlefields on the oceans. And so the British are employing all of their resources to fight Napoleon. And so in a way, the French kind of help us win indirectly, because the British are so busy fighting Napoleon that the United States and our little fight called the War of 1812 is like second or third or fourth in their priority list of problems. And the War of 1812 is pretty devastating for the United States in a lot of ways, because the British burned down Washington, D.C., the White House. Almost the entire city is torched. But we do come out of it because, quite frankly, the British are sick of fighting after Napoleon is done. So in the same year that the United States declares war on the British, Napoleon decides to invade Russia in 1812. The reason he decides to invade Russia is because Russia is not adhering to his continental system. They're kind of breaking the program, and Napoleon says, man, if we're going to beat the British, obviously we can't get to Great Britain because they control the waters. But if we can get to them economically, then maybe we can be successful. Russia's not playing game. And so Napoleon gathers his forces and launches the biggest military expedition, really up to this point, into Russia. Okay? And this is really what's going to undo Napoleon. Hitler, by the way, as I've been making some comparisons, Hitler makes the same mistake later in history. Napoleon started too many fights with too many countries, so did Hitler. Napoleon failed to invade Great Britain. Strategically important. He failed with Trafalgar, and to be fair, Hitler failed to invade Great Britain. With the battle over Britain, he launched tons of air raids in World War II, but he failed to invade Great Britain, and instead turns his attention to Russia. Both Hitler and Napoleon turn their attention to Russia and invade. And in case this is a spoiler, I'm going to say it anyways. Both Hitler and Napoleon are defeated in Russia, not so much by the Russian army as by the Russian winters. Okay? And that's going to be the problem. I need you to look at this. Napoleon's empire in 1810. Okay? And you can look at the little key up here. This will tell you what's going on. Countries that are aligned with Napoleon because he beat them in battle. Countries that are directly controlled by Napoleon and the purple, the actual literal territory of France at the time, and here's the countries at war. It's really just Portugal and Great Britain. And so Napoleon, if he could have finished off the British, if he hadn't have failed at Trafalgar, then maybe he could have, taken the war directly to Great Britain and not even invaded Russia. That is literally the same story as what's going to happen in World War II with Hitler. Okay? As Russia is being invaded, they're going to be pulling back towards their significant cities like Moscow. And when Russia withdraws from the continental system, Napoleon invades. And Russia retreats from the invading French army using a system called scorched earth tactics, waiting for the Russian winter to finish off Napoleon. What's a scorched earth tactic? Well, you defend your town, but if it looks like Napoleon's going to take your town, then you burn the town before Napoleon gets there. And you're like, what? You'd burn your own town? Well, if you leave your town intact, then Napoleon's going to pick up supplies and pick up things that he needs for his grand army. You're going to defend a bridge, but if it looks like Napoleon's going to take the bridge, then you blow up the bridge or destroy the bridge so they can't use it. Now they have to build, pontoons or boats to cross the river, slowing them down. And each time you slow them down, we're getting closer to the Russian winter, and their supply chain is getting thinner, and they're going to be less successful in conquering a giant place like Russia. That is literally what happens just a little over 100 years later with Hitler. Scorched earth policy. The Grand Army of Napoleon invades Russia with more than 600,000 troops. Just to put that into perspective, George Washington, who lived just before Napoleon, right? They were alive at the same time for a while. Okay? But George Washington never had more than 15,000 troops under his command. Napoleon has 600,000. Napoleon kind of bragged that nobody could beat him because he spent so many soldiers' lives a day. He's like, I've got an endless supply. You'll never beat me. Because I have the manpower that's trained, you could never kill enough of my guys to beat me. By the time he returned to France after Russia, he had somewhere around 40,000 troops with him. If you go Google this, you'll see some different numbers, but you'll get the same general trend. His troops were killed in battle, but most of them died from weather or were captured or deserted. I don't know if you know what deserted means. They just left the army. They're like, we got no food here, and it's falling apart. What happens is when Napoleon got to Moscow, he got to Moscow, and he took Moscow, but the Russians had burnt down Moscow by the time he got there. So when he got there was no supplies, there was no one to fight, and there was no one to surrender to him. So he beat the Russians, but there was nobody to beat. And so he doesn't have enough food and supplies to last the Russian winter. And so they leave Russia, and on the way, Russians pick them off one at a time. And a lot of them just die from the cold. And so it's a tragic loss for Napoleon. Didn't really lose on the battlefield per se, but he lost because of this scorched earth strategy. Again, later it's going to be used by the Russians against Hitler. I put canned food on here because most people will say that Napoleon's army was the first time that people used canned food. Canned food is amazing because you can cook it and then seal it, and it's ready to eat. Yeah, it tastes better if it's warmed up, but it's cooked food that's preserved for years. And so he was able to, help his supply chain. They didn't have refrigeration. Obviously, you don't need that in the winter, but you need refrigeration or fresh meat will go bad in a couple of days. You can smoke it and salt it, take the moisture out, like jerky, right? If you leave jerky out on the counter for weeks, it's good, but still you're talking a couple months, Canned food is different. So it's kind of showing you how there's like an evolutionary of supplies that really affect how how successful a military is. Napoleon had the Arc de Triomphe built in Paris. It's probably one of the most famous icons in all of Paris. This is kind of an overview, like all the streets in Paris that are leading to the Arc de Triomphe. If you come towards the Arc de Triomphe on the Champs-Élysées, it's probably the most famous street in all of Paris. And if you pop out on the exact opposite side, it's a giant roundabout. You pop out on a street called the Grand Army, or Rue is how they say street in Paris. But it's one of the most iconic things in Paris, and it was built to try to show off Napoleon's greatness as he was conquering Europe. Now, after the devastating invasion of Russia, Napoleon is forced to abdicate and is exiled to a prison island in the Mediterranean Sea in 1814. So he returns, right? He invades in 1812. By the time he gets back to France in 1813, his army is depleted and his power is waning. And so everybody gangs up on him in the Sixth Coalition, and he is forced to abdicate. Interestingly enough, they don't put him to death. People respected Napoleon. Even his enemies respected him. And so instead of killing him, they get him to abdicate, saying he's no longer going to be the emperor of the French. But he still gets to be emperor of just a tiny little island off the coast of Italy called Elba. And he's not allowed to leave, and nobody's allowed to visit him. So it's kind of like a prison, but it's not like a horrible dungeon prison where he has to stay behind bars. It's like his own little private island where he's still the emperor, but it's just of a little tiny dinky island called Elba. Okay? Now, Napoleon is not done. Napoleon finds a way to escape Elba, and he goes back to France, and he tries to reform his army. People refer to this as the 100 Days because he has about 100 days from the time he escapes Elba until he is finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. So he escapes. He escapes and he returns to power. And he quickly tries to rebuild his army and conquer Europe again. The problem is, the rest of Europe is like, no way, we're doing this again. And so they get to Napoleon before he has a chance to re-solidify his power completely. And so the final battle is the Battle of Waterloo. And people talked about the Battle of Waterloo for the next 100 years as the most amazing battle to ever take place in the history of Europe. It's his final battle. He is defeated by the British and a coalition of forces like the Prussians play a big part in it. It's the Seventh Coalition. And in 1815, Napoleon is finally defeated for good. Again, they don't kill him. This time they exile him to an island in the middle of the Atlantic. Actually, it's just off the coast of Africa. They put him on an island called St. Helena, and it's there he dies in 1821. So 1815 is the end of Napoleon as far as a political influence, but he actually dies in 1821. And really, for the next 100 years, he's probably one of the most dominant people talked about, and the impact of what Napoleon did is felt for the next 100 years. It's not until 1914, literally almost exactly 100 years later, where another war breaks out that is unbelievably bigger than Napoleon's wars. But people couldn't imagine that at the time. And what I'm talking about is World War I. Okay? So that's 100 years after Napoleon. After Napoleon, the winning powers, this coalition of European countries, basically everybody but France, gets together and they try to work out a lasting peace. And they try to establish a balance of power so that one country, like France, can't get too strong and cause trouble. So the major powers of Europe meet together to work for long-term peace in Europe. And they're going to create this balance of power. I'm going to talk a lot more about the Congress of Vienna in a couple weeks in my notes. So we're not done talking about the Congress of Vienna. It's a big deal, but I'm going to deal with that in a later lecture. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, was defeated by two armies of the Seventh Coalition: the British army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army in the modern country of Belgium. So if you want to go to the historical site and see the Battle of Waterloo, it's in Belgium. And this really marks an end to the Napoleonic Wars. And people, you can find all kinds of videos on YouTube that will talk about the military strategy and how Napoleon was doing great but didn't have his full strength, and how the British and the Prussians came in and were able to beat him, and he was forced to abdicate the throne again after this 100 days. But again, you're not going to ever be tested on military strategy on an AP test, so I don't spend an incredibly lot of time on it. But if you're into military history and into military strategy, there's nothing as great as the Battle of Waterloo to kind of wet your whistle if you're into that kind of stuff. Now, here's just a little summary of the Napoleonic Wars. Notice it's with an S. The first and second coalitions take place during the French Revolution, with Napoleon conquering Italy. Okay? And he also goes down into like Egypt, all the way into Egypt. In fact, when he's in Egypt, his troops find the Rosetta Stone, which allows people to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's a huge deal in history. Before Napoleon's army was in Egypt, nobody could understand Egyptian hieroglyphs. But some of his soldiers, while they were down there, find this stone that had a tablet written in three different languages. One of them was in Greek, and one of them was in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And by using that, the Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphs, they were able to decipher Egyptian, and it opens up Egyptology and the history of Egypt. I know it's kind of weird. We're talking about Napoleon, and the Egyptians lived thousands of years before Napoleon's time, but it was his army and troops that kind of paved the path to the study of Egyptian history. The third coalition is defeated by Napoleon in 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz, while the Battle of Trafalgar saves Great Britain from invasion. So that was a part of the third coalition. The fourth coalition is defeated as Napoleon when he by Napoleon as he disassembles the Holy Roman Empire and establishes the continental system against Great Britain, or the United Kingdom. Sorry, I got tongue-tied right there. The fifth coalition, Britain participates in the Peninsular War. So the Peninsular War is a part of the Napoleonic Wars, and by peninsula, I mean Spain and Portugal, if you will. And so Napoleon invades Spain and into Portugal, and Napoleon's brother, Joseph, is placed on the throne of Spain, and they defeat Spain, but also the Spanish never really give in. So they kind of start this guerrilla warfare against the French, and so it's a constant source, a draining of military resources, because the Spanish never really give in. The other thing is, because Spain loses to Napoleon, it kind of cripples the Spanish government, and so the Spanish territories in the Americas are going to seek independence from Spain because Spain is weak, because they were defeated by Napoleon. So this right here is going to cause Mexico to gain its independence, and the countries of Central America and most of South America, and we'll talk about that again in another lecture, but just kind of tie these things together. The sixth coalition defeated Napoleon at Leipzig after his failed invasion of Russia, and he's exiled to Elba, and then he escapes from Elba and goes back for 100 years, right? And the seventh coalition defeated Napoleon for the final time at Waterloo, and he's exiled to St. Helena. Okay, so that's just a little recap of the Napoleonic Wars. There's no video, there's no photography. Okay, there is going to be photography in the 1800s, but it's not going to be like action shots. They're still shots. Like during the 1800s, we're going to get some photos of American presidents and actual cowboys and stuff in the United States, and we're going to see some of the actual monarchs of Europe have photography done of their families and themselves. But we don't have any like photographs from the Napoleonic Wars, so it's all paintings. Okay, this is Europe, 1815. You can see that Prussia and Austria are being born out of the Holy Roman Empire. And Napoleon said, whether he really said this or not, history is a set of lies agreed upon. And as I said before, the Rosetta Stone was discovered by an officer in Napoleon's army while they were stationed in Egypt. And it's the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics. So, in an interesting way. La Marseillaise is the national anthem of France. I don't know if you've ever listened to the lyrics, but the song was written in 1792. And it's all about the French Revolution, and it's a bloody song. I mean, it's like, grab your knives and grab your spears because the enemies are coming to kill us. Protect the Republic, protect the Republic. I mean, if you go and listen to it, it's one of the most famous national anthems in the world. Obviously, you guys know the Star Spangled Banner because you're Americans, but for the rest of the world, it's one of the most famous. Just a little reminder that there's tons of great videos, review videos, on Napoleon and his conquests. And I also have some that I'll be assigning on Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, and other topics. But thank you for joining me. This is week 15, the Napoleonic era.